on chapter 10. We're going to start chapter 10. Hopefully we could even, God willing, finish chapter 10, depending on how things go. It's the shortest chapter in this mimer. It's the shortest ois. It's very succinct. It really only has one fundamental point that it's making, which is a very interesting one, actually. Until now, we've been exploring several of the Rambam's 13 principles of faith. The Yud Gimel Ikrim, the Rambam's 13, his attempt to summarize Jewish belief in 13 main points. And we've been explaining them in the Chassidic way, right? Which means we've been explaining how each one, everything that we know about God in the 13 principles of faith begins or starts in the realm of the rational. It starts as something that can be understood and argued and perhaps even proved. We start with an intellectual understanding of God. And then we move higher and we exceed that with a understanding of God who is transcendent and beyond understanding. He's beyond rationality. We can connect him only with emunah, only with faith, only with the super-rational. Good evening. So basically, what we've been showing is all of the principles of Judaism, all of the basic beliefs of Judaism about God that we really know only through faith and not through rationality. And we've been explaining how the super-rational understanding of God fits with the rational understanding, right? Like, for example, we've been explaining, good evening, we've been explaining how, for example, we explained how philosophy, traditional Jewish philosophy, like the Rambam, explains what it means that God is wise and God has wisdom and God has an intellect. And then we explained why that understanding is insufficient according to that understanding has many problems and was insufficient for many other Jewish sages who followed more in the tradition of the Kabbalah, who followed more in the tradition of the faith understandings of Judaism. And then we explained how those two things fit together, how God both has intellect and yet is not defined by his intellect, how there is a certain extent to which you can understand God rationally, you can understand what it means that God has an intellect and God has wisdom, and then there is God as he transcends that, and God as he is beyond that, and God as he is not defined by that. And this is true of every means by which we might define God. Any means by which we might pin God down to any one definition or any one meaning, there's always a problem with it. There's always a limitation to it. And God in himself transcends any definition, even any negative definition, as we've explained at length, that you may want to ascribe to him. You can't say that he's wise. You can't even really say that he isn't wise. He isn't wise also doesn't grasp God in himself. There's nothing you can say about God in any fashion. God transcends all intellect and all understanding, which is really the mitzvah of faith in God, as the Tzemach Tzedek explained it at the beginning of our discourse. The mitzvah of having faith in God is that a Jew is obliged to relate to God not only in the expressions of God, not only in his manifestations or in his light, in godliness. We are obliged by the Torah to have faith in God. We are obliged to know God as he transcends all of these limitations as well, as best as possible, right? When we say know him, we don't mean intellectually, obviously, because this is beyond the intellect. We mean know him at a soul level, to have faith and to connect to this reality as it's given to us in Torah and through the prophets. And that's what we've been discussing very broadly. And chapter 10, the shortest chapter, is going to discuss the third of Rambam's 13 principles, with basically the same gist, but we're going to say it in a very interesting way. And really it's a self-encapsulated. This short little chapter is sort of a self-contained a very nice idea in Chassidus, sort of unto itself. You don't even really need the rest of the discourse really to understand this little chapter. So without further ado, let's just start at the beginning again, even though we began last week as well. So we're on page 311 in the English, under the big X, and we are at the beginning of Perek Yud. We should mention that today, Chaf Daled Teves, which was last night and today, was the yortzeit of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad Chassidic. The Tzemach Tzedek is his successor and his grandson. So we study and we are thankful to the Alter Rebbe for sharing the light of Chassidus, that we may partake of this wisdom and this godliness this evening, and in the schus of the Alter Rebbe, in his merit, and in the holiness of the Chassidus that he shared, and the connection to God that he gave to the world, the connection to God that he gave to the Jewish people in his own unique way. In that merit, and in the merit of our study, we should, God willing, improve in our own service of Hashem, both spiritually and physically, in mitzvahs and in learning and in all things, God willing. L'chaim.
Were there primarily Farbrengens last night then?
Both nights. The tradition is to do both nights. There's no, either night is what I mean. Not everyone both nights, but what I mean is that the Farbrengen is often the night after. It depends how it works out, but often the Farbrengen is the night after as well.
9:30 if you have a chance.
There's a Farbrengen tonight at 9:30 at the Casa de Poliger. All right, chapter 10. Achar shedisbaru ha'ikar habez v'chol prate ikar ha'hei beprakim ha'kedmim v'olu kuhugan baruch Hashem. After we have explained the second principle in all of its details, and the fifth principle in the previous chapters, and we have resolved it all. It has all been logically resolved. Thank God. We come now to explain the third principle of faith. What is the third principle of faith? That God is not embodied, and He also has no keach b'guf. There's also no potential for a body, which, as we're going to see in our chapter, has quite a broad definition in Chassidus. We are going to say that this negates from God a great many things that other people may think are appropriate to ascribe to God, as we will see. V'yirtzu b'zeh. What the Rambam intends by this is as follows. This is a quote, I believe. Yes. Bittul hageshamus. We negate all materiality from God. That we do not ascribe to Him what we ascribe to bodies, for example, movement or rest. And the verse which refers to this is, you did not see any form. God is of no form. You cannot ascribe to God anything that is ascribed to a limited body or a limited form. Aside from the verse, this is obviously a very logical conclusion. I think practically all monotheistic religions have come to this conclusion one way or another. It's just simple sense, right? If God has a body, that totally detracts from all of his transcendent, infinite properties. It prevents him from being the first cause. You'd have to explain what that body means. There's all sorts of philosophical issues that arise in saying God is embodied. We should note, and I did note this before, the first time we talked about the Rambam's 13 principles, that there are actually Jewish sources and Jewish opinions, although they are in a very small minority, that have said in Jewish history that Judaism does ascribe a body to God. This is not the normative Jewish belief. In other words, this is not this is not the way the halacha goes. If the halacha is determined according to the majority, it is not Judaism to believe that God has a body. However, there have been minority rabbinic opinions which, based on the Chumash and based on Scripture and based on what it appears to say, have said that God actually does have a body. And basically, and philosophically, deal with it, basically. Right. In other words. So
when we say God puts on tefillin, like...
Right, or God took the Jews out of Egypt with an outstretched arm, right? So the Rambam would tell you that it's all metaphorical, right? It's not referring to. Really, Chassidus would say the same thing. It's just a disagreement on what we mean by the metaphor. But the bottom line is that all of these descriptions of God are not descriptions of what they seem to be on the most literal reading. which is okay because we don't read the Chumash literally anyway, right? We read it simply, we don't read it literally, right? We read it in the Pshat, as you'll learn if you study Rashi on any parsha of the Torah, you'll see that the Pshat, the straightforward reading, is not the same as the literal reading, right? Rashi's straightforward reading has to borrow from all sorts of midrashim. He has to use his head. He has to explain things according to all sorts of other sources, right? He uses the grammar to try and arrive at the simple meaning. The simple, straightforward meaning is not the literal meaning you would get from a direct English translation, right? That has never been a Torah interpretation of the Torah. So,
in that case, why does it even need to be mentioned? Like Erech Apayim and so on and so on. He says, God is kind, whatever.
Different people would have different answers to that question. It depends who you ask. The simplest answer, which is really the Rambam's answer and the philosophical answer, is that the Torah is speaking in a way that human beings can relate to. That's the usual Dibra Torah Koloshim B'nei Adam. The Torah speaks
for the bad,
yeah. So for the good and for the bad, that's true. The point. There's a general principle that was actually mentioned in the Gemara that someone who is looking to make a mistake, there's always room to make a mistake. In other words, if you try and take into account everyone who's looking to come to the wrong conclusion, you'll never be able to say anything. Is also a principle, right? There's no such thing in human language as saying something so definitively that no one could possibly ever make a mistake. It doesn't exist, right? The language itself is a certain. Chassidus talks about this. How language itself has a certain ambiguity and limitations built in, such that most human experience cannot really be conveyed perfectly in words. When you speak to someone, they really have to know already what you're talking about to a certain extent to be able to communicate with them, right? So the whole notion that there's any work that could be written in human language, that there's no room to make mistakes about God is not true. But you're right. But on the other hand, the question is asked very powerfully by people who disagree with the Rambam. In other words, the problem is not so much that there's room to make mistakes. It's much stronger than that. The problem is that once you say parts of the Torah are purely metaphorical, then it's carte blanche, right? If you're not following any rules, right? Why is the whole thing metaphor? Maybe when God says I have to put on tefillin, that's also metaphorical, right?
It's like putting an obstacle in front of a blind guy, because so many examples are given as if God has like human parts.
Yeah,
and
to an extent.
That, we were created with the image of God. So
yeah, what I'm saying is that it's a debate whether the benefits outweigh the costs of that decision, and there are plenty of people that argue on the Rambam and the philosophical interpretation and say that the Torah is purely metaphorical is in the sense that the Rambam means it, in the sense that, of course, God doesn't have an arm, and it's just saying that so that we'll understand it and we'll appreciate it, that's very problematic and a very problematic way of understanding it. Chassidus would not agree with that. Chassidus says that God does have an arm. It's just a question of what we mean by arm, right? Is more the way that Chassidus would read it. But that's a separate issue. When we say God has an arm, we don't mean he's bodily. As we're about to see, we're going to understand, according to the Tzemach Tzedek, how he understands what it means that God has no body nor potential for a body in spiritual terms, and we're going to see that it's not a contradiction. It's not a contradiction exactly what we're saying. Okay. Well, the Mashin is Bar Le'el Perek Gimel, and 2 lines up in the bottom of on page 311. The Mashin is Bar Le'el Perek Gimel. Be'inyan bir ha'amana. According to what we explained before in chapter 3 of this discourse, which was many moons ago for us, Be'inyan bir ha'amana, explaining what faith is. Shehu yisbarech l'mayla mayla me'bechinas chachma v'seichel klal. If you recall, the Tzemach Tzedek's definition of faith is different than the Rambam's definition of faith, right? This was the opening salvo, indicating to us that we were going to take everything the Rambam says and we are going to question it and disagree with it and reinterpret it and the whole thing, right? Because the Rambam says that faith is the belief in God's perfection, as can be intellectually understood. The Tzemach Tzedek and Chassidus and Kabbalah say that faith is a connection to God as he totally transcends intellect, right? Which is what we're saying here. You'll recall from chapter 3 that when we say emunah in God, when we say faith in God, according to the Kabbalah and according to Chassidus, we mean a super-rational connection to God through the soul, right? God as he is totally transcendent of intellect in every way is the God of faith, so to speak, to Kabbalah. God, not as he invests himself or as he creates, you could put it either way, intellect and the world of limitation and the rational world, but God, so to speak, causally before that. God as he exists above the created world with its rules of logic and the limitations of intellect and it's the rule of rationality. God exists before that state, and it is God as he transcends that, which is a God that is not communicable in any way, right? Even if you knew what God was as he transcended intellect, you couldn't tell me, right? Because it's not an intellectual notion, right? It's not something that can be understood, right? It's something that has to be experienced directly through the soul, which is exactly how Chassidus explains it happens, right? That the person has a godly soul, and that godly soul connects or is aware of this reality, and the Torah helps him. The Torah conveys this reality, even though it uses limited words. The Torah has its root in godly intellect and the whole thing, and the Torah shines this light of godliness upon one's soul, and it's a whole story. So the Torah is what helps you, and through the soul, one has a relationship with God as he transcends intellect, and that's called faith. This is the super rational relationship with God.
Say that one more time.
Which?
The very last sentence. God has transcends.
Yes, God transcends intellect.
No, before that, just
Which part?
I want to play that again.
The soul, using Torah, connects to God at a level beyond intellect, and it is this connection to God as he transcends rationality that is called faith, according to the Kabbalah and Chassidus, if that's what you're looking for. So that's what so Tzemach Tzedek is bringing that up again. So in other words, we are going to explain what it means that God does not have a body, nor the potential for a body, in terms of this understanding of God. In terms of this, which is a philosophically austere understanding. If you say that God himself is totally transcendent of intellect, that means you are throwing out a lot of things that are not God. Right? Which is exactly what the Tzemach Tzedek says the Rambam means when he says how the Tzemach Tzedek reads the Rambam when the Rambam says God has no body and he has no form of a body. The form of the body, or the potential for a body, which is where things get a little fuzzy, we know what a body is. What's the potential for a body? So the Rambam is going to explain that the potential for a body and intellect are connected one to the other. So faith in God as he is beyond intellect, is faith in God as he has neither a body nor the potential or the form of a body, as he will explain. Vehine. What's the connection between intellect and the form of a body? Well, second line on page 310. Kol ha-nivrayim haruchniim heim b'chinas sichliim nivdalim. All of the spiritual creations are abstract intellects. Sichlim nivdalim, which literally seichel, which is intellect, nivdal, like havdalah, right? Separation. They're separate. They're abstract intellects, which really, this is a philosophical term as well. You won't just find this in Chassidus, you would find this in the Rambam, and indeed in many other places as well. Spiritual beings are abstract intellects. What does that mean? At the simplest level, this means an intellect without a body. Right? If you ask a philosopher, if you ask the Rambam, what is an angel? When we say there are spiritual beings, right? Beings that are not embodied, right? What is that being? That being is an intellect without a body, right? Because a human intellect, as we understand it, as we relate to it in day-to-day life, is enclosed within a body. However, there is no reason to assume, and here is where we must make an unfortunate break with most modern interpretations of what's the term? I suppose biology.
Because how can an intellect has no body? What is it?
We could have this discussion at a different time. I could discuss this for at least an hour. Just this. So. The bottom line is that the question from Chassidus' point of view, really the question from almost any religious point of view, is not how can the intellect exist without a body, it's how can the intellect exist with a body. That's the real question, right? The unfortunately we come from within a general culture which somehow has come to believe that the intellect just is the body. right? Which is a position called eliminative materialism, or at least reductive materialism, which is an extremely troubled position. In other words, the people whose job it is to think about these things generally do not hold that position because of how difficult it is to hold. But unfortunately, the popular culture has come to have a belief that the mind is the brain. Right? The brain is like a computer, and yada, 1,000 articles there. The brain is like a computer, and you can see a person's mind in brain scans, and the whole thing, and it's a very long story. But the bottom line is that this point of view is not how Chassidus sees it. The way Chassidus sees it, and in fact the way the Rambam sees it, and pretty much everyone, I think, that we've mentioned so far, sees it, is that the mind is a spiritual reality that is attached to the body, that is invested in the body to one extent or another, right? There's different ways of looking at that. And in fact, Chassidus explains many levels, right? So here's actually, we should open it up to the broader topic because it'll help us a lot in our chapter, otherwise I'll probably have to explain it again.
How's it different from emotions being connected to the heart?
No, we're not saying mind as opposed to emotions. We mean
No, I know you're not.
When we say mind now, we mean the soul generally. We mean all that you experience as a subjective being. All of my things that I experience. I have my emotions and I have my mind. The mind is more spiritual than the emotions, but that's a separate question. As I was about to say, there's many levels. So maybe we should take a step back. So we're going to talk here about the difference between physicality and spirituality. Now, in the traditional view, and the way Chassidus explains it, the difference between the physical and the spiritual is actually less severe than the general modern mind would take it to be, right? The general perspective, what you would call I'm trying to think how deep to go into this. The act of creation, when God creates something, there's essentially two different parts to it, right? There's the physical matter of the thing, and then there is the spiritual nature or the form of the thing, right? In order for God to create a tree, right? First, there's the actual physical stuff of the tree, which does not precede the 6 days of creation. In Judaism, right, there is no physical reality before God creates the universe. And that physical reality also has an inner nature which is given to it, which corresponds to a spiritual source, right? So, for example, in an apple, as the Alter Rebbe famously says in Torah, the Alter Rebbe's Yortzeit, we'll quote the Alter Rebbe, the sweetness of an apple comes from chesed of Atzilus. In other words, the form, the nature, what it means to be a sweet apple has an inherent spiritual connection at, understandably, a great and perhaps even infinite remove from, infinite in some ways, from the kindness in the world of Atzilus, from God's kindness, as we've been describing it in our discourse. The apple has a source in that kindness. Yeah, at a great remove, but that's ultimately where it comes from, right? Or you could look at it a different way. We say that Torah is the blueprint for the world. It's really the same idea in different words. To quote, translated into a different sort of idiom, but it's the same idea that God looked in the Torah and created the world. The source of the world is in Torah. There's a blueprint, right? This idea that there is a spiritual blueprint for the world, right, refers to what? Refers to the nature of things, right? The nature of the apple, the sweetness of the apple, comes from chesed of Atzilus, right? A bitter apple, a Granny Smith apple, has a connection to Gvura of Atzilus. At a very, very great remove, it's understood, right? It's not the same thing at all, but that is the ultimate spiritual source for the nature of this thing. Now, what's the source of the matter of the apple, right? The appleness, the fact that it is an apple, the nature of the apple, comes from kindness of Atzilus. Where does the matter come from? from? And the answer is, the matter doesn't really come from anywhere. This is what's called Bria Yesh Ma'ayin. Creation, something from nothing. It has no source. That's the whole, if you read the second part of Tanya, the Shari Yichud Ve'emunah, the first few chapters, that's the Alter Rebbe's whole theme there, that that's why the world is just godliness, because there is no source. So there is no cause for the physical matter of the world. It is simply created, quote unquote, from nothing. It's created by God's infinite power. It's not understood. It's not understandable how something can be created from nothing, right? Which is the whole point, that if you create something from nothing, what is it really? It's really only the power that is constantly creating it. As the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, it has no individual identity because there is no reality on which its identity as a physical creation is based. He's really talking there about about the form and the nature as well. He doesn't really separate the two, but I'm just saying that in the physical, this is most obvious, that there is no prior reality on which the physical nature of the apple depends. It is created from nothing. And since it is created from nothing, it has no inherent reality to itself, so really all it is the power that creates it. See the first 3 or 4 chapters of Shar Yichud Ve'emunah in Tanya, the second part of Tanya.
No, but it's not really fair to say.
Sorry?
Because, if you say it like that means, God didn't create anything.
Mm-mm. No, he did create it. It's a whole, you're right, to an extent, but not really, no. Of course he creates it. It's saying he created something, but all the thing is the godly power that creates it.
But there's a whole magic.
That's how it's
able to convert nothing to something.
It is, so to speak, magic. It's a miracle. It's a constant miracle. In fact, the Alter Rebbe describes it over there. He explains that it's far more miraculous than the splitting of the sea, and there's 3 diyukim on how there's higher and higher ways of understanding the splitting of the sea, and the creation of the world is greater than all of them. Shar Yichud Ve'emunah, first 3 chapters. First 3 or 4 chapters.
The sweetness down into a different level.
Because the spiritual nature of the thing, right? We have to go back again. It's a good question. Thank you for asking it, because I'm not entirely I'm in the wrong mindset, because to me it's all laid out already.
Is it analogous that the brain is an organ and the mind is a spirit manifested?
We're going to connect it back to that, but not yet. So so you asked, why is the sweetness a separate thing? Very good question, because according to the modern narrative, which is what I'm saying, it's very hard to learn Chassidus properly, to my understanding, within the modern narrative, unfortunately, right? There's a certain popular philosophy that is very hard I'm speaking from personal experience, that's very hard to shake off in trying to understand Chassidus, but which is basically necessary to shake off, because it has all the wrong assumptions and all the wrong suppositions. Mm-hmm. So in modern physics, if you ask the average scientist who, it's a whole long discussion, but you ask the average scientist, it's a whole discussion why it is this way, whatever. And also don't think I'm knocking science, it's quite the contrary. Just this aspect of the narrative surrounding science, which is a separate thing from the science itself. You have to understand here's the bottom line. The bottom line is that if you ask a scientist what sweetness is, most people on the street, not even a scientist, in fact, the scientists have a better chance of saying it correctly. The average person on the street, if you ask what the sweetness of the sweet apple is, they'll try and reduce it down to mechanical, physical interaction, right? They'll say it's a certain chemical interacting with your taste buds, which then sends a signal to your neurons, etc. ... And in the ... is where the mind is that cannot be explained physically. In other words, there is a physical component to everything, which is where the confusion comes in. There is a physical component to sweetness. There's a physical manifestation of sweetness. But the actual soul of a sweet apple, in other words, the experience, the human experience, which science would say this is less real than the physical. We say it's more real than the physical. That the actual experience of biting into a sweet apple is something that cannot be explained physically. Because what physical system can manifest the experience of the sweetness of an apple? The taste of an apple can be you can point to concurrent or connected or correlated physical causes. I'm not arguing with you. I'm just explaining.
But my question is, why is there this difference?
One second. So the bottom line is that the sweetness of the apple, according to Chassidus, does not ultimately derive from its physical form, from the physical chemicals and the interaction with your body's physical chemicals. On the contrary, these are. It's like saying the meaning of the sentence derives from the words in the sentence itself, right? Which is not true, because there are dead civilizations and we see their languages and we have no idea what it means, right? The letters themselves are meaningless. The letters are a means to convey the experience, a means to convey the meaning, right? It's the same thing with the physical, that the actual experience of biting into the apple cannot be reduced to anything physical. However, it is a physical apple that is conveying, that you actually have to put in your mouth and eat to receive that experience, right? So in other words, we have a subtle and complex system here, an interaction of the spiritual and physical. However, ultimately, there is a difference. Ultimately, there's a point beyond which you go, so to speak, on this spectrum, right, at which you have something which is completely physical and you have something which is completely spiritual. So the reason why, when you have an apple, we say the matter has one source and the form has a different source, is because the actual stuff, the fact that it exists on a physical plane of reality, is not reducible to spirituality. In other words, it's not. This is a unique quality that an apple has that justice does not have. I'm saying justice as a notion. Justice as a concept, right? The concept of justice and an apple share things in common. They both have forms that are they both derive from God. They both have forms and natures that derive from God. God creates both things. However, there is a cutoff point at which you have to say that the apple simply exists on a plane where justice does not. Right? Justice does not exist. It does not have a physical manifestation the way that an apple does. Right? Is that clear? So the apple the apple ultimately has a physical component which cannot be said to have a limited or defined source in spirituality, because it's created something from nothing. It has no source. There is no logic to how this is possible. One second. As opposed to the form and the nature of the apple, which the form and nature of an apple and the form and nature of justice, especially if it's a bitter apple, may at some point meet up. Right? They exist in the same realm. They exist in the same, so to speak, area. So in other words, the world is really an amalgam of soul and body. And it says in Chassidus explicitly, everything has a soul and a body. In fact, every part of everything has a soul and a body. Right? Everything is or v'kli, light and vessel, which is really different words for the same thing. Right? Everything has a light and a vessel. Everything has a vivifying, inner spiritual force, which is the deepest truth of that thing, and happens to be where the thing connects to God. The deepest truth of everything is where it connects to God and has its source in godliness. And there's also the physicality, the actual body, the physical body of the thing, which also comes from God, but not in the same way. It comes from God in an inexplicable way. There's a leap. It's created by God's infinite power. So that's physicality and spirituality in Chassidus. And what should immediately be clear is that everything has both, right? The apple is both physical and spiritual. This is what I was saying at the beginning of this whole diversion, that the spiritual and physical divide that we would normally ascribe to, which the common philosophy nowadays would put forth, that if there is something spiritual, it exists as totally separate from the physical, which is something that philosophers would call Cartesian dualism, which has its whole own kettle of fish. Some people might say that's where everything went off the rails. It was Descartes ruined everything. It's a whole other discussion. But the whole idea that the spiritual and the physical are totally unrelated realities that don't mix and don't exist in the same thing is totally foreign to the worldview of Chassidus. I'll just give another quick example. When we say the soul is in the body, we have a very similar thing. the soul is in the body as a unique spiritual entity. There is a part of the soul which is totally non-physical. But then, as you descend lower in the soul, from intellect through emotions, and you get to the lowest parts of the soul becomes more and more correspondent to the actual physical body, until there is a point which is described in Chassidus, I don't know why and I don't know what it means, so don't ask, as the point where it's called the heat of the blood. The heat of the blood is the highest and most refined and most ephemeral aspect of the body, the physical body as it is alive. In other words, the life of the physical body, what you would call the highest still physical aspect of the body being alive, is the heat in the blood, and the lowest part of the soul are invested one in the other. The heat in the blood is actually where the two things meet and, so to speak, become one, in a process that is, I'm not sure if it's fully understandable at all.
Do they become one?
Yes, they become one. In other words, a human being is a soul and a body together. They're not separate. The body is not as explained explicitly, as the mashpiyim like to say in yeshiva, the soul is not like a battery. The body is not a machine waiting for a battery and the soul is stuck into it. That's not how it works. The soul and the body are totally united. They become as one entity entirely. The human being is both of these entities united together completely. It's not like a battery that you could switch out.
No,
right?
but the soul without the body is almost like meaningless.
No.
And the body without the soul as well.
Right.
Okay.
But this is the relation between the two.
It's both.
So when it comes to intellect can be by itself without having a body?
Yes, that's what we're saying. We're saying that there is an aspect of the intellect. This is exactly how Chassidus would explain it, right? So you would ask, right? Let's say you would ask the question, which is a common question. If the intellect is spiritual, how come you can detect people's different thoughts with these brain scanning techniques, right? Like you put someone in an fMRI and you show them a certain picture and then you show them another picture and they see different parts of the brain light up, right? As all the popular studies talk about. So the answer is that there's different things. There's different levels of the soul. The soul at its lower levels, the lower parts of all the aspects of the soul, are very much involved and entangled with the physical processes.
But for you to analyze, you need to look at the physical things. You cannot see it from the spiritual side.
No, from the outside, sure. From the inside, of course you can.
Inside, but that's the only thing.
So the question is, here's the take-home question from this little part of the discussion. The homework question is which scientific measurements from outside a person have ever been made from outside the standpoint of a subjective human soul? In other words, the scientist himself, stuck inside of his own subjective spiritual soul reality, especially when he's doing science, which is a very analytical process, which requires induction and abstraction and all of these higher functions, right? So the scientist's notion of how the brain works, where is that found? His subjective experience of the notion of how the brain works, where is that found on the brain scan? Right? In other words, he himself, in his process of trying to understand the brain, he himself is working from within the position of the soul, which is totally physically undefined.
The fact that we don't know what it is doesn't mean that it doesn't exist somewhere.
Right. So the question is, will science understand it one day? That's what the whole debate is. The whole debate is whether that's even theoretically possible. Right.
When you look at the intellect, what do you expect to be the outcome of the intellect?
What do you mean?
What does intellect do?
That's a very good question. Yeah, why do you ask?
Because the question is, can intellect survive without the body?
Yes. Intellect precedes the body. Intellect, the soul, as we describe it in Chassidus, is intellectual and is cognizant and uses seichel before it ever comes into the body. In fact, the body, generally speaking, in terms of most of the soul's powers, if not all of them, is a limitation on the soul's powers. The soul knows things much better and sees much better. It's all these spiritual, which are all spiritual definitions of the thing, obviously, which is the true definition, right? In other words, we say the soul sees in Gan Eden, but obviously it doesn't have eyes, and obviously there's nothing physical to see. But the thing is that that's the higher version of seeing. That's the truth of seeing. When the soul is embodied and there's an actual, to see something, you actually have to use physical vessels to actually perceive it. This is an incredible blindness of the soul from the eyes of Chassidus. It's a different way of looking at things. It's a different perspective. In other words, the whole fact that your spiritual soul, which is really a godly and an unlimited thing, which is not ideally in the Garden of Eden confined to one physical place and one physical time. It has to come down and it has to see things through a pinhole, right? It's defined by the body. What the body does affects it, right? If a person has eaten better, they think better, right? If a person's fasting, it's very difficult to think, right? If a person sees only as well as their eyes are vessels, these are incredible constraints for the soul, right? This is one of the reasons why it says that al karcha atachai, right? You are forced to live, you're compelled to live. The soul, as it's in the Garden of Eden, doesn't want to come down into the body, right? Because this is a constraint. This is an incredible clamp on the soul's ability to do all of these things. So what we're saying here, I'm glad that we have this discussion now, because
Does the sweetness then survive the rotten apple that never gets eaten?
No, because then the apple's rotten, right? What do you mean?
In other words, sweetness comes from the spirituality.
Yes.
Given the fact that inanimate objects, their souls don't go to Gan Eden.
Yeah.
But the goodness, let's change the dynamic. The goodness of a man survives his death.
I'm not even sure what that means.
Soul survives death. We know that. It survives the death of the body.
Yes.
So for the inanimate object, the apple that we use, does the sweetness survive, or does it just get changed to something else?
Does the soul of an apple survive the death of an apple? I don't know. That's a very good question. That's actually a very good question. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know.
It goes somewhere.
I don't know. It depends. It depends how low the soul of the apple is. Whether the soul of the apple is totally bound up with the physicality, in the sense that if the physicality is destroyed, the apple is completely destroyed. I don't know. These are very good questions.
Well, I think the argument they give with dogs is that the soul of the dog does not go to God. The dog has a soul, but it does not.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a typical Chabad house class. I don't know the answer to that question either. I don't know. I've never. Yeah.
The night my dog died, he had no lecture on it.
Okay.
So let's go back to the mind and the brain.
So 1 second. So all spiritual creations are abstract intellectual entities. In other words, what we're saying is that when we say something is spiritual, he's really defining what it means to be spiritual. We mean that it is something like the mind. It's a philosophical definition, really. It's something like the mind, but it doesn't have the limitation of a body. Right? It's an abstract intellect. That's what we mean by abstract intellect. Sichlim nivdalim.
Ethereal awareness.
Yes, exactly. And what I was talking about before, like, for example, justice or kindness, right? These are abstractions that we deal with in daily life. This is more the sort of thing. I wouldn't say that's what an angel is, exactly.
They do have the body, though. The kindness is created by the actions of physical bodies.
Oh, that's not clear at all, right? God's kindness exists before anybody's.
That's God's kindness. But
we're going to see. Maybe God's kindness is included. Maybe God's kindness is included.
Let's go to justice then, because justice is relative.
Well, justice is God's severity. With
justice, human justice is all relative to the eye of the beholder. But justice is not necessarily connected to a body. Justice is the result of the actions of bodies.
I don't know if that's true.
9 guys on a jury, 13 guys on a jury, 12 guys on a jury say thumbs up or thumbs down. That's and depending on who perceives their ups and downs, say it's either justice.
Is the sweetness of the apple a created by humans perceiving it?
Each person's perception of sweetness is different.
That may be so, but that's a limitation in the person. That doesn't mean it's objective.
Exactly. Well, all I'm saying is that justice. Whereas the apple carries the sweetness because Hashem created the apple, Hashem created the actions of the human beings that allows us to perceive something as being justice or not justice. Not Hashem's justice, but our interpretation of human actions as being just or unjust. It
was just an example. So the question of whether these abstract things that arise in our experience, you have an independent abstract reality, is one of the oldest questions in philosophy. You can go look up Plato versus Aristotle, and you'll see it's a whole thing. But that's not. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. We're saying that the definition of something spiritual is like the mind, But the mind is removed from the body. The mind is abstract. And that's what, in a sense, that's what an angel is, in a more refined sense. Perhaps a little harder to grasp exactly what it is, but essentially it's a seichel nivdal. It's an intellect that's not limited by the body.
Even though all the angels that we know, they all came into this world in the form of a body.
Yeah, so did every soul, you know. That doesn't mean that they did that there's no form in which they exist above that, right?
So
Or beyond
I
that.
have a question. So does the form come from godliness or above godliness?
From godliness. Everything comes from godliness.
From godliness. So
Everything
so it
comes from
filters down.
Yes, of course.
Right.
Of course.
So the apple, the form, not the form, but the
The
matter
nature, yeah.
is also through godliness.
Yes, of course.
It all comes through it.
Of course. It's not whether it comes from God or not, as we're going to see, is really the gist of this chapter, which we only have 10 minutes left now. As we see when we it's not a question of whether it has a source in God or not. It's a question of the process whereby it's created.
Right,
That's the difference.
right.
Which is really the physicality itself is not created through a process. It's created through a leap. It's created something from nothing.
Right.
Something from nothing is another way of saying there is no process.
That's why I ask: is that coming through?
Yes, from God. Created
Well, I know from God.
from Or Ein Sof. There's no with no intermediary. That's
what I was asking.
from the inscrutable to the non-understandable
Right.
is what it's created from. All right.
So something from nothing is the equivalent of what we would understand to be magic.
Yes, it is absolutely.
And his creation.
Yeah, that's one way of calling it. Yeah, something when Hume. That's what Hume called it. When he was trying to debunk the whole notion of causality in general, he called it magic. Right? That something should appear from nothing. And there's a whole. It's the people who say that he won that led to the general understanding that is the opposite of what we're trying to say here. But that's all. So I've mentioned too many non-Jewish philosophers already in this class. It's not good. V'hine. Okay, va'afilu, third line on page 310, I'm going to read it. Va'afilu hasvirus she'ena likus. Even the spheres, which are godliness, even in the world of Atzilus. In other words, even what we've been describing as God's wisdom, God's kindness, God's will, these highest spiritual manifestations, are ultimately, as we've said several times, the source of the intellect as it exists in the creations. In other words, these things themselves are ultimately limited, right? These things themselves are, so to speak, of the intellect. When we say God's wisdom, this was the Maharal's whole claim against the Rambam, is that when we say God's wisdom, we're still saying ultimately it's limited. It's connected to human intellect, even though it's different, even though the Rambam's conception of God's wisdom is really beyond human understanding, as we've explained at length earlier. Ultimately, the source, even though it's just the source of human wisdom and human intellect, because it is the source, because you can trace back human wisdom to God's wisdom, like you can trace back the sweetness of the apple to God's kindness, these things are all ultimately, there's what's called a shaychus, there's a relationship between them and the physical. Because they are the source of the nature of physical things, this itself is indicative that they are limited, that they are confined, that they are constrained, right? In this sense. Aval, however, Musa Yisbarich, he himself, second to last line on page 310, Enei begeder chachma, is not defined by intellect. If you haven't picked that up from the class by now, you should have attended more classes. If you said this at least 1,000 times, God Himself is not intellect. He's not within the realm of intellect. Kanal ba'arichus, even Tzemach Tzedek says, as we said before at length. Hine, page 313. Yispadesh ha'ikir hazeh lefizeh. So according to this notion, that God Himself, though He is the source of intellect, which intellect in this context, you have to understand, is synonymous with limited spiritual beings, right? We've said, what is a spiritual being? It's an intellect without a body. So what is intellect? Intellect is a limited spiritual being. Intellect is our general term for all spiritual manifestations, non-physical. They're not bodily. They have none of that thing that distinguishes the apple from justice. They don't have that. They don't extend into this realm. They exist in a different reality. There's a different plane called the spiritual plane where they exist. However, They are all limited. They all are ultimately the source of limited things that do interact with bodies. They have a shaykhus, they have a relationship with the physical, even in a very, very abstract way. So all of these things are ultimately in the realm of intellect. They're in the realm of limited spiritual beings, as opposed to God himself, who transcends intellect. And the Tzemach Tzedek is saying, in light of this distinction, we can now understand what the Rambam means when he says that God has no body, nor the potential for a body. Second line on page 313. Heyes she'enei keach beguf. Being that God has no, he's translating it here, bodily power, which I've been translating as potential for a body. Ratzo lemar, which means to say, she'enei memachus keches haruchni. When we say God has no bodily power or no potential, no bodily potential, we mean that he is not of the same type, he is not of the same essence as all of the spiritual powers and potentials, shehem bechinas sichliyim, which are all intellectual, right? Which are all limited entities. So in other words, we are understanding, as I said at the beginning of the class, we are understanding what the Rambam says in a very austere way. We are understanding it in the Chassidic way, since the Chassidic faith is higher than the philosophic faith, right, so too our understanding of the 13 principles is also higher. When I say more austere, I mean that it's stricter. We're limited to fewer conceptions of God. What do I mean? The simple understanding of what the Rambam says is that God, when God doesn't have a body and he doesn't have the potential for a body, is that he neither has an arm, nor does he have anything which, so to speak, is metaphorically, you could say he has a metaphorical arm, even that he doesn't have. That's what the Rambam means. He doesn't have an arm, and he doesn't have a metaphorical arm either. God is just God. There's no parts to God, right? It's a similar, in line with the idea that God has no parts, right? Chassidus is reading this further. Chassidus is saying, who even needs to mention that God has no body? Obviously. Who even needs to mention that metaphorically God is captured by no metaphor? That's certainly true. Even the Rambam arrived at that conclusion, right? We're going further. We're saying not only is that the case, that he has no body and he's not captured by no bodily metaphor, but God is also totally transcendent of the spiritual. He's transcendent of anything that has any relationship to being intelligible, which by intelligible here we mean a limited spiritual entity. So God totally transcends not just the physical, not just metaphors of the physical or extensions of the physical understanding. God transcends the spiritual as well. And this is really the main point of this chapter. God transcends not only the physical, God transcends the spiritual as well, as he will explain further. Ratzo Leimer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down on page 313. She'im heyes hanruchniim, even though these beings are spiritual, mislavshim beguf gamken, they also enclose themselves in bodies, kenefesh ha'adam shemislavish beguf, like the soul of man which is invested in his body. V'nikra keach beguf, and then it is called a power invested in a body, a spiritual power, a spiritual potential which is invested in a body. In other words, that's keach beguf means soul in body. That's the way that Tzemach Tzedek is reading this phrase. What I've been translating as potential for a body, or bodily powers is how he translates it. The Tzemach Tzedek is reading it, Keach beguf means soul in body. So in other words, God has no body, and God also transcends anything that is a soul in a body as well, or has the potential even to be a soul in a body. Anything that can be embodied, right? Anything that is or can possibly be embodied, God transcends. Even the intellectual bodies which are not enclosed in a body, they are not very different from the spiritual things that are invested in a body. As I was just saying, that the sweetness in an apple, which is very much invested in a body, it very much is connected to the physical body of the apple, right? It ultimately has a relationship with the kindness of God in Atzilus, right? Which means that it has a relationship with all of the intermediaries, right? With the angel Michael, which is the angel of kindness, Malach Michael, right? And the kindness of Bria, and the kindness of Yetzirah, and the kindness of Asiya, right? It's not just a leap one to the other. It's a whole series of steps, right? But the point is that it has a relationship with all of these things, right? They're not so different. They share something. They share something in common, right? Now, you should just note that there are other Maimarim which explain the other end, right? There are some places where we explain we make it sound like Atzilus, the God's kindness and Atzilus, God's kindness and the sweetness of the apple are practically next door neighbors. And there's other places where the whole emphasis is that you cannot even reach one from the other by any normal intellectual process, right? It is almost impossible to understand as God's kindness, right? Nevertheless, here we're emphasizing the other side, that even though you cannot really go easily from one to the other, this is not a close relationship at all, nevertheless, they're not sufficiently different enough to say that they are two totally different things. The sweetness of the apple, which can actually be enclosed in a physical thing, which you can experience by actually interacting with it physically, which is the ultimate, in terms of the big picture, is the ultimate degradation, as I was trying to explain before, is the ultimate lowness. This denotes an incredible limitation, that the sweetness of the apple, which is a spiritual thing, can be confined to a certain time and a certain place and be attached to a certain physical being, is a very, very low spiritual truth, the sweetness of the apple. And because that has some relationship with God's kindness, really God's kindness it appears low by comparison. The fact that one is even the source of the other means that they are not really completely different, right? Aval hu yisbarich, as opposed to God Himself, last line on page 313, enei me'erka mumuhusam klal. He is not commensurate nor of the same essence of these things at all. For who, which is this was what the Maharal was saying. God has no connection to any of these things. God remains alone. God remains utterly undefinable in any terms at all. Positive terms, negative terms. Don't bring God into things. Because if you bring God into things, this would be the problem you have, right? You would say that God ultimately knows about the apple as by definition, as what it means to be God involves knowing the world. All of a sudden, there's this connection between them. All of a sudden, God is like this thing who exists spiritually. He's like a limited and defined spiritual entity to some extent. What we say in Kabbalah and what we say in Chassidus, this is emphatically not the case. God Himself is not be'erech, is not commensurate, is not of the same essence of the world, nor of any spiritual power which has any connection to the world, which we're calling intellect, which we're calling rationality, right? Which, remember, rationality just means a limited spiritual entity in our context. He is wondrously exalted above even the sublime spiritual entities, just as He is concealed from the lowest worlds, meaning to say the physical world. God is as hidden and as mysterious and as transcendent of the spiritual world as He is of the physical world. This is one of the radical things that Chassidus says. The point, yes. This is one of the radical things that Chassidus says. That God is not grasped any more spiritually than He is physically. God is transcendent of both realms. He is transcendent of both parts, both sides of this system are equally transcended by God. Ella, he's going to say it even more clearly here, 4 lines down on 312. Just as you cannot ascribe physicality to Him, God forbid, Kain mamash, so too, literally, you cannot ascribe to Him intellect or spirituality, God forbid. Just as you cannot, God forbid, say that God is physical, so too, God forbid to say that He is spiritual. God forbid. Right? Spiritual, meaning defined as a limited intellectual entity in any sense, which the truth is that when we're talking about the world of Atzilus, that really is infinite, at least in most definitions of infinity. But nevertheless, because of its relationship with the physical, because ultimately it is defined, it is a place of definition, because God's infinite kindness is different than His infinite severity, that itself is a finitude. Just as a side note, this is what it says elsewhere in Chassidus. Therefore, all of this is all considered spiritual. These are the spiritual realms, and God is neither physical nor spiritual. You are as likely to find God Himself walking around the world of Atzilus as you are to find Him walking around the physical world. This is not going to happen in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'm not sure it makes a difference where exactly, but
we discussed that a long time ago.
Yes. Rather, he is exalted above them with a great transcendence. This is explained in Tanya, in Shar Yichud Ve'emunah, chapter 9, at length. Okay, so that's the main idea, and then there's a little finishing section here where we explain a pasuk according to it, which we'll save for next week after the review. So, are there any outstanding questions, at least right now? I'll stop the broadcast at least, and then maybe some people will remember.